Picture a man standing before the Roman Senate, 35 knife wounds later, his blood pooling at the foot of a statue of his greatest rival. Julius Caesar did not fall to a foreign enemy, nor to the barbarian tribes he had conquered across Gaul. He fell to his own friends, his own peers, men who dined with him, fought beside him, and called him brother, because they believed that killing one man was the only way to save a republic that had already been dying for 100 years. This is the story of how a 5-century-old system of shared power collapsed into the hands of emperors, and how the murder meant to prevent a king created one anyway. Rome in the 1st century BCE was not the empire of marble columns and triumphant legions that later generations would romanticize. It was a republic under enormous strain, a political system built for a city-state now struggling to govern a Mediterranean-spanning territory. The Roman Republic had been founded, according to tradition, in 509 BCE, when the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was expelled and the Romans swore never again to submit to the rule of a single man. In his place, they built an intricate system of checks, 2 consuls elected annually, a senate of aristocratic elders, and a series of assemblies where citizens could vote. For centuries, this system worked well enough. It balanced ambition against ambition, and no single man was permitted to hold power for long or to hold it alone. But by the time Julius Caesar was born, likely on the 13th of July in the year 100 BCE, into the ancient and moderately distinguished Julian family, the Republic's machinery had begun to grind against itself. Rome's conquests had transformed it. Wars in Spain, in Africa, in Greece, and in Asia Minor had brought staggering wealth into the city, but that wealth had not been shared evenly. Small farmers, the traditional backbone of the Roman legions, found themselves ruined by long military campaigns that kept them away from their land for years, while wealthy senators bought up their farms and worked them with slave labor imported by the tens of thousands from conquered territories. A vast underclass of landless, jobless citizens crowded into Rome itself, hungry for reform and increasingly willing to support any leader who promised it. This tension had already exploded once before Caesar's rise, in the careers of 2 men whose bitter rivalry set the template for everything that followed, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius, a brilliant general and Caesar's own uncle by marriage, had reformed the Roman army, opening its ranks to landless citizens and effectively creating a new kind of military force, one whose loyalty flowed not to the abstract republic, but to the general who paid and rewarded them. Sulla, his rival, marched his own legions on Rome itself in 88 BCE, an act nearly unthinkable a generation earlier, and later returned in 82 BCE to make himself dictator, purging his political enemies in bloody proscriptions that saw thousands of Romans killed and their property seized. Sulla eventually resigned his dictatorship and restored constitutional government, apparently believing he had shored up the republic's defenses. In truth, he had demonstrated something far more dangerous, that Roman legions, if bound tightly enough to their commander, could be turned against Rome itself. Julius Caesar grew up in the shadow of this violence. His family had allied itself with Marius's faction, which put the young Caesar in real danger once Sulla seized power. Sulla reportedly spared Caesar's life only reluctantly, warning his allies, according to later Roman historians, that there were many Mariuses in this young man. Caesar spent his early adulthood building the connections and reputation any ambitious Roman needed, military service in Asia Minor, a stint studying rhetoric on the island of Rhodes during which he was famously captured by pirates and held for ransom, an episode he treated less as trauma and more as an opportunity to demonstrate his nerve, reportedly promising his captors he would return to crucify them once freed, and then doing exactly that after his ransom was paid and he raised a small fleet. Caesar's rise through Roman politics followed the traditional cursus honorum, the sequence of offices a Roman aristocrat pursued on his way toward the consulship, but he pursued it with unusual ambition and enormous, sometimes ruinous, spending. He borrowed vast sums to fund public games and building projects that won him popularity among ordinary Romans, a strategy that left him deeply in debt but built the political capital he needed. He served as quaestor, then aedile, then was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's state religion, a position of significant prestige he obtained partly through outright bribery. By 63 BCE, the same year Cicero served as consul and crushed the conspiracy of Catiline, Caesar had positioned himself as a leading voice of the popularist faction, the politicians who built their power through appeals to the common citizens and the popular assemblies rather than through the Senate's traditional aristocratic channels. The turning point came in 60 BCE, when Caesar formed an informal alliance with two of Rome's most powerful men, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great, a celebrated general who had crushed pirates in the Mediterranean and expanded Roman territory across the eastern provinces, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputedly the wealthiest man in Rome, who had made his fortune partly through real estate speculation during Sulla's proscriptions and partly through crushing the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. This arrangement, which modern historians call the First Triumvirate, was not an official government body and held no constitutional standing whatsoever. It was simply an agreement among three ambitious men to combine their political influence, their wealth, and their military reputations to override the Senate's resistance and secure what each of them wanted. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted tax relief for the business interests he represented. Caesar, elected consul for 59 BCE, wanted a major military command that would let him build the kind of wealth and martial glory that Pompey already possessed. He got it. Through legislative maneuvering, intimidation of rival consuls, and the raw leverage the triumvirate provided, Caesar secured command over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, later extended to include Transalpine Gaul, for an unusually long term of 5 years, later extended again to 10. It was this command that would transform Caesar from a talented but conventional Roman politician into one of history's most consequential military commanders, and it was this same command, and the army loyal to him that came with it, that would ultimately place him on a collision course with the republic he had sworn to serve. In March of 58 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul to take up the command he had so carefully engineered, and what followed was one of the most consequential military campaigns in ancient history. Gaul at the time was not a unified nation but a patchwork of dozens of tribal confederations, from the Belgae in the north to the Aquitani in the southwest, held together loosely by shifting alliances, trade networks, and periodic warfare. Rome already controlled a southern strip of territory known as Gallia Narbonensis, but the vast majority of Gaul remained independent, and Roman merchants and diplomats had long eyed its wealth in grain, cattle, and manpower. Caesar's pretext for intervention came almost immediately. The Helvetii, a large tribal confederation based in what is now Switzerland, had decided to migrate westward through Roman allied territory in search of better land, and Caesar seized on this movement as justification for military action. He defeated the Helvetii in 58 BCE and then turned his attention to Ariovistus, a Germanic warlord who had been expanding his influence into eastern Gaul at the invitation of one tribal faction. Caesar's own written account of these campaigns, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, remains one of the great primary sources of ancient military history, though modern historians read it with appropriate caution, since Caesar wrote it partly as political propaganda intended for audiences back in Rome, carefully shaping his own image as a decisive, clement, and supremely capable commander. Over the following years, Caesar's campaigns expanded far beyond their original justification. He fought the Belgae in 57 BCE, campaigned against tribes along the Atlantic coast including the seafaring Veneti in 56 BCE, and crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory and the English Channel into Britain in both 55 and 54 BCE. Expeditions that produced more prestige than practical conquest but electrified audiences back in Rome who had never seen a Roman army venture so far. Each campaign season, Caesar sent detailed and carefully worded reports back to the Senate, and the Senate voted him unprecedented public thanksgivings, celebrations that both honored his achievements and, not incidentally, kept his name constantly before the Roman public. The climax of the Gallic Wars came in 52 BCE, when a young and formidable Gallic nobleman named Vercingetorix, chieftain of the Arverni tribe, managed something no other Gallic leader had achieved. He united a broad coalition of previously rival tribes against Roman occupation. Vercingetorix adopted a scorched earth strategy, denying Caesar's legions food and supplies, and inflicted a serious defeat on Roman forces at the Battle of Gergovia. For a moment, it appeared Caesar's entire Gallic project might collapse. But Caesar regrouped, and the decisive confrontation came at the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, where Caesar's engineers constructed an extraordinary double ring of fortifications, one facing inward to besiege Vercingetorix's forces trapped in the town, and one facing outward to defend against a massive Gallic relief army arriving from outside. Despite being caught between two enemy forces, Caesar's legions held both lines, and Vercingetorix, facing starvation and defeat, surrendered. He would later be paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph and then executed, a brutal and typical of Roman treatment toward defeated enemy leaders. The human cost of the Gallic Wars was immense. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, suggest that Caesar's campaigns resulted in roughly 1 million Gauls killed and another million enslaved, figures that modern historians treat as likely exaggerated for rhetorical effect but that nonetheless point toward campaigns of extraordinary violence and displacement across the region. Whole tribal populations were destroyed or scattered, and the flood of slaves and plunder that came back to Italy made Caesar staggeringly wealthy, wealth he used strategically, funding public works, distributing gifts, and buying the loyalty of politicians and ordinary Romans alike. But the political situation back home was shifting in dangerous ways while Caesar remained in Gaul. Crassus, still eager to match the military glory of his triumvirate partners, launched a campaign against the Parthian Empire in 53 BCE and was killed at the catastrophic Battle of Carrhae, an event that removed the third leg of the triumvirate's fragile balance and left only Caesar and Pompey, whose interests were no longer nearly as aligned as they once were. Pompey, back in Rome, drifted increasingly toward the Optimates, the conservative senatorial faction that had always viewed Caesar with suspicion, and in 52 BCE the Senate named Pompey sole consul, an extraordinary and constitutionally irregular arrangement granted specifically to restore order after prolonged street violence between rival political gangs in the city. By 50 BCE, it had become clear that a reckoning was approaching. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, led by figures like Cato the Younger, argued that Caesar should give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen before seeking further office, precisely so that he could be prosecuted for the many legal irregularities of his earlier consulship and his Gallic command. Caesar understood perfectly well that surrendering his army meant surrendering his safety, his political future, and possibly his life. He proposed compromises, including that both he and Pompey disarm simultaneously, but the Senate, egged on by Caesar's enemies and backed implicitly by Pompey's legions already stationed in Italy, refused. On the 10th of January in 49 BCE, Caesar made his choice. He led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the small stream marking the boundary between his provincial command and Italy proper, an act that under Roman law constituted an unambiguous act of war against the Republic itself. According to later tradition, he uttered the phrase, alia iacta est, the die is cast, acknowledging that there was now no path back to the old arrangement. The civil war that followed Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon unfolded with startling speed. Pompey, despite commanding significant political support in Rome, had not yet assembled the legions needed to confront Caesar directly in Italy, and rather than risk a battle he might lose, he made the fateful decision to abandon Rome itself, withdrawing south and eventually crossing the Adriatic Sea into Greece, where he could gather forces from Rome's eastern provinces and allied kings. Caesar entered Rome without significant resistance, an occupation that shocked contemporaries precisely because it happened almost bloodlessly, and he used the opportunity to secure the state treasury and consolidate political control before turning to deal with Pompeian forces still active in Spain. Caesar's Spanish campaign of 49 BCE, culminating in his victory at Alerta, neutralized Pompey's legions in the western Mediterranean and demonstrated the same speed and decisiveness that had characterized his Gallic campaigns. He then turned east, pursuing Pompey into Greece, where the two former allies finally met in direct battle. The decisive engagement came at Pharsalus in August of 48 BCE. Pompey commanded a considerably larger force, but Caesar's veteran legions, and his tactical innovation of holding back a fourth line of infantry to counter Pompey's cavalry, secured a decisive victory. Pompey fled the battlefield and made his way to Egypt, hoping for refuge with the Ptolemaic court, whose young king Ptolemy XIII owed a debt of gratitude to Pompey's earlier patronage. Instead, Ptolemy's advisors, calculating that executing Pompey would curry favor with the victorious Caesar, had him assassinated as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly afterward in pursuit, he was reportedly presented with Pompey's severed head, and, according to ancient sources, wept at the sight of his former ally and son-in-law's fate, whatever political calculation may have accompanied that grief. Caesar's time in Egypt produced one of the most famous episodes of his life, his entanglement in the Egyptian succession dispute between Ptolemy XIII and his sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra VII. Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim, and the two began a relationship that would produce a son, Caesar Ion, and that tied Caesar personally and politically to Egypt for years afterward. Caesar remained in Alexandria through a difficult siege before securing Cleopatra's position on the throne and then moved on to deal with remaining threats to his authority across the Mediterranean, including a swift campaign against Pharnaces II of Pontus in Asia Minor in 47 BCE, a victory so rapid that Caesar summarized it to the Senate in the famously terse phrase, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Pompeian resistance did not end with Pompey's death. Loyalist forces regrouped in North Africa under commanders including Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio, and Caesar campaigned against them through 46 BCE, securing a decisive victory at the Battle of Thapsus. Cato, refusing to accept Caesar's clemency or live under what he saw as tyranny, took his own life at Utica rather than be captured, an act that later Romans, especially those hostile to Caesar's memory, would elevate into a powerful symbol of republican martyrdom. A final Pompeian resistance, led by Pompey's own sons, was crushed at the Battle of Munda in Spain in 45 BCE, bringing 4 years of brutal civil war to its conclusion. Caesar returned to Rome as its undisputed master, and the constitutional arrangements that followed made the scale of the Republic's transformation unmistakable. He had already been appointed dictator on more than one occasion during the years of civil war, following established Roman precedent for temporary emergency powers, but in February of 44 BCE, the Senate, dominated by Caesar's own appointees and allies, granted him the title of dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, a title that broke entirely with the Roman tradition of temporary emergency authority and effectively made him monarch in function if not officially in name. Caesar used his authority to enact a substantial program of reform. He resettled veteran soldiers and the urban poor on new land, extended Roman citizenship to more provincial communities, initiated ambitious public building projects in Rome, reorganized the calendar into the solar-based system that, with minor later adjustments, remains the basis of the calendar used across much of the world today, and took steps to reduce the burden of debt weighing on ordinary Romans. Yet alongside these reforms came signs, deeply alarming to the traditional Roman aristocracy, that Caesar's ambitions extended towards something resembling formal kingship. Statues of Caesar were placed among those of Rome's ancient kings. He wore special ceremonial dress and a gilded chair was set aside for his use in the Senate. Coins were minted bearing his own living image, breaking with the Roman tradition of only honoring the deceased on currency. At the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 BCE, Caesar's ally Mark Antony publicly offered him a diadem, the traditional symbol of a Hellenistic king, and though Caesar pointedly refused it before the crowd, the episode did nothing to calm the fears of senators who saw in Caesar's growing accumulation of honors an unmistakable trajectory toward monarchy, the single political outcome the Roman Republic had defined itself against since its founding nearly 5 centuries earlier. The conspiracy that formed against Julius Caesar in early 44 BCE drew together an unusually varied group of senators, united less by a single ideology than by a shared conviction that Caesar's accumulation of power represented an existential threat to the Republic's ancient constitution. At its core stood Gaius Cassius Longinus, a proven military commander with a long-standing personal grievance against Caesar, and Marcus Junius Brutus, whose name carried enormous symbolic weight in Rome, since his ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus was traditionally credited with expelling Rome's last king and founding the Republic 5 centuries earlier. Brutus's personal position was especially fraught, since Caesar had shown him considerable favor over the years and, according to some ancient sources, may even have been Brutus's biological father through his long affair with Brutus's mother Servilia, though this claim was likely political rumor. Altogether, the conspiracy eventually drew in somewhere between 60 and 80 senators, an extraordinarily broad coalition for a plot of this kind, reflecting just how widespread the unease about Caesar's position had become even among men who had personally benefited from his patronage. The conspirators chose the 15th of March, the Ides of March, as their moment, timing the assassination to coincide with a scheduled Senate meeting at the theater of Pompey, ironically held in a building complex constructed by Caesar's former rival and son-in-law. According to ancient accounts, Caesar had received a number of warnings in the days beforehand. A soothsayer had reportedly cautioned him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia experienced troubling dreams the night before and pleaded with him to stay home. Caesar nonetheless proceeded to the Senate meeting, reportedly persuaded to attend partly by Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and a man Caesar trusted deeply, who assured him the warnings were meaningless and that his absence would insult the assembled Senate. What followed has become one of the most famous political murders in world history. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretext of presenting a petition, and at a signal, Tullius Cimber pulled at Caesar's toga, the cue for the attack to begin. Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow, and the other conspirators quickly joined in, stabbing Caesar with daggers they had concealed for the occasion. Ancient sources record that Caesar received a total of 23 wounds, though only one, according to the physician who later examined the body, was considered fatal. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus, attributed to Caesar upon recognizing Brutus among his attackers, comes not from any contemporary account but from later literary tradition, most famously William Shakespeare's play, and its historical accuracy remains unverified, though ancient historian Suetonius does record that Caesar said something similar in Greek upon seeing Brutus approach. The conspirators, who called themselves the liberators, believed that killing Caesar would immediately restore the traditional republic, and they had made remarkably little plan for what should happen afterward. This proved to be their critical miscalculation. Rather than being welcomed as heroes who had saved Roman liberty, they found the public reaction deeply ambivalent, and Caesar's ally Mark Antony, then serving as co-consul, moved quickly to capitalize on the chaos. At Caesar's public funeral, Antony delivered a masterful and inflammatory speech, reading Caesar's will, which revealed generous bequests to the Roman people, and displaying Caesar's bloodied and torn toga to the assembled crowd, whipping public sentiment into fury against the assassins. Rioting broke out, the conspirators were forced to flee Rome, and any hope of restoring the old constitutional order collapsed almost immediately. What followed was not a return to the Republic but a fresh round of civil war. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, the 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, soon to be known as Octavian, returned to Rome to claim his inheritance and, despite his youth, proved himself a shrewd and patient political operator. Octavian initially allied with Antony and another prominent commander, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE, an arrangement that, unlike the informal First Triumvirate, was granted actual legal authority by the Senate, and which conducted its own brutal proscriptions against political enemies, among them the great orator and statesman Cicero. The triumvirs then pursued the fleeing conspirators, defeating the combined forces of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where both Roman aristocrats ultimately took their own lives rather than face capture. The alliance among the victors did not last. Lepidus was gradually pushed aside, and Octavian and Antony, the latter now deeply entangled politically and romantically with Cleopatra in Egypt, drifted toward open conflict. Their rivalry culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra died by suicide the following year as Octavian's forces closed in on Egypt, bringing an end to the independent Ptolemaic kingdom and to the last serious military resistance to Octavian's supremacy. In 27 BCE, Octavian, now the unchallenged master of the entire Roman world, made a carefully staged show of returning power to the Senate and Roman people, only to have the Senate immediately grant him extraordinary powers and the honorific title Augustus, by which he is known to history. He carefully avoided the titles and trappings that had made his adoptive father's ambitions so visible and threatening, presenting himself instead as merely the first citizen, princeps, among equals, even while wielding power more total and more permanent than Caesar had ever possessed. The Roman Republic, whose institutions had endured for nearly 500 years, had given way, this time permanently, to the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar's assassins had killed a man in the hope of preserving a system, but that system had already grown too fragile to survive the underlying forces, wealth inequality, an army loyal to individual commanders rather than the state, and a political culture addicted to the ambitions of extraordinary men, that Caesar himself had merely brought to their conclusion rather than created.